Well, let's even take that to another extent. Maybe it's more than hangry. This is inappropriate use of his power. Do you realize this is the only time that Jesus ever uses his power to kill something? Only time. Did the Father give Jesus power to kill or to give life? To give life. What's he killing for? I know I might go in a different direction here, but frankly, this is almost like an impeachable offense. Why? There are a whole slew of people who say this is a misuse of his heavenly power out of human anger. Bertrand Russell, the famous poet, actually left Christianity because of this passage. T.W. Manson, one of the great scholars of the 20th century, biblical scholars, said this: "This is a tale of miraculous power wasted in the service of ill temper." And then think about this, he makes a good point. For the supernatural energy employed to blast the unfortunate tree could have been more usefully expended in forcing a crop of figs out of it. And as it stands, it's simply incredible. And he means by that, back in the day, not believable. It's not believable. One of the reasons that you were looking for the historical Jesus and not the supernatural Jesus that we believe in. It's just a man had a bad day. We're going to see he goes to Jerusalem. It seems like he continues to have a bad day. So what's going on here? Notice too, it says at the end of verse 14, and his disciples heard him say it. Very unusual there, because the Greek tense is the imperfect again, the iterative imperfect, which means they lingered on it. They heard him say it, and they continued to hear it. In other words, they lingered. They didn't forget this reaction. It was a serious overreaction in their mind. And they're going to keep thinking about it, and we need to keep thinking about it too as we go to the next story, which now we need if we're going to understand what is going on with the fig tree and why it's here, why it's important. So on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus then goes into the temple courts. Now before we go any further, I need to take a break, and we need to do a little bit of history. Again, sorry for those who hate history. But if we're going to really enter into the story here and get into the skin of Jesus, we need to understand the temple. Absolutely crucial we understand the temple. First of all, here's Jerusalem. This is Jerusalem. The whole thing here is Jerusalem at the time it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. This is the whole city back in 70 AD. Okay, now in the black outline, which I know is hard for you to see, so I'm drawing it right now. The black outline is the city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, at the time of our story. And what you can see is it's not a really big city, but there is one big, nasty structure, big, huge structure that dominates this city, and that is the Temple Mount Complex. Say that with me. Temple Mount Complex. Within the complex, right here, is the temple itself. Okay? But I want you to try to get just visually an idea of how big this thing is relative to this significant city. It dominates the city of Jerusalem, doesn't it? Also, I want you to notice, too, this wall here. This is the Kidron Valley, Mount of Olives. Jesus would have come down like this. And when you come up here, you would have come into the temple. Right there is the gate, the eastern gate. You would have come in right there. You go right into the temple. Not into Jerusalem, the city. You go right into the temple when you come from the side, which is where everyone's coming from. They're going from Jericho. Last thing I want to just point out while I'm here, this wall right here is the only thing that's still there. And that's called the Wailing Wall. The only thing left. Now let's drill down. Keep in mind the size of the city, okay? Now let's drill down and look at the complex a little better. Here's the complex that he walked in, okay? Here's the eastern gate that he walked through. I don't want to stand in anyone's way. When you came in through the gate, you've got this giant courtyard that surrounds the temple. Are you following me so far? Yeah. Okay. This courtyard was called the Court of the Gentiles. The Gentiles could not go into the temple because they're not holy, they're unclean. Only the Jews could go here. Actually, only women could go here, men could go further, and priests could go further. Graduated holiness. We'll talk more about that in a few weeks. But I want you to realize that if you're a Gentile and you're seeking God, You can never go into that temple where God supposedly resides. But you can be near him, near the presence of the Lord, by coming and worshiping in the courtyard of the Gentiles. But what does Jesus find when he walks in there? The Big E. How many of you went to the Big E or have been to the Big E? Okay, that's what he finds when he walks in here. Chaos, marketplace. It's supposed to be the place where the Gentile can come close to the God of Israel. All right, now, with this in mind, notice the size of the temple compared to the complex. The temple is much smaller, right, than the whole complex. Now, I want you to just look at, now I'm just going to show you the temple. Let's take a look at that. Now, the temple. This is Solomon's temple that he built that was magnificent. And here's Herod's temple. Now, what's going on with that? I'm going to skip, actually, Billy, I'm sorry, I realized I skipped that quote, the cultural background about the temple. Then we're going to come back to this slide. This is a cultural note from the NIV Archaeological Bible. The size of the temple was limited by the biblical precedent of Solomon's temple. But pagan temples of the New Testament era were becoming increasingly mammoth, and the Jerusalem temple, if confined just to the biblical standards, would have seemed puny. So, although the temple proper was left fairly small, the temple precincts in Herod's scheme were enormous. That's what I'm trying to show you. The entire complex is enormous. Zerubbabel's temple, which was the temple built when the people came back from exile and Solomon's temple had been destroyed. They rebuilt a new temple that wasn't as glorious as Solomon's, if you remember. That had to be torn down, and then they filled in the surrounding valleys. And in the area where they used to do the temple stuff, they built Herod's temple, but then they built it out even beyond that. Massive retaining walls helped to support the platform of this massive complex. And the western retaining wall is the familiar Wailing Wall. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea of what they're trying to show the grandeur of Jerusalem, the grandeur of Israel. All right, let's go back to the temple for a minute. Now we're back to the temple, okay? You can see it's so much bigger than Solomon's, but this is the area that was used. But this is just part of the entire complex. But to give you an idea of how much size are we talking about, look down here. Here is Herod's temple, just in a square. This is an American football field. Is a football field pretty big? This temple is about 3 times the size of an American football field. Can you get that in your head a little bit? 3 times the size of an American football field, and yet it's puny within the entire temple complex. We're talking a massive structure. Now, why am I making such a big deal of this? Here's why. Don't miss this. The structure, the main structure of a people, not only shows its grandeur, but it defines what that people is all about. Let me give you an example. If I say the city Paris, what structure comes to mind? Eiffel Tower. If I say Rome, what structure comes to mind? Colosseum. If I say New York City, what structure comes to mind? Empire State Building. Look at that. I didn't even have to prep you guys. Bing, bing, bing. Why? Think about those structures. Why isn't there an Eiffel Tower in Rome or in New York City? The Eiffel Tower is a work of art. It's in the City of Lights, the artistic, romantic city. It's perfect. The Colosseum, why isn't that in New York City? Because it represents the glory of the Roman Empire, which is what Rome still lives off of to this day. And what does the Empire State Building say about New York City? It's the site of economic prosperity in the land of, the American dream. The structure of a city declares what it's about. Its identity. The Temple Mount was meant to scream to the world the greatness of the God of Israel. Jerusalem was to be a city where the living God met with human beings. And so this temple is supposed to represent the very meeting place of heaven and earth, where heaven and earth come together. If you want to almost think of it science fiction, it's like where the portal of heaven is open. That's Jerusalem. That's what the temple is supposed to represent. And it does it. When people would see the Temple Mount, they would be awe-inspired, just like they ought to be with the God of Israel. It did exactly what it's supposed to do. When you saw it from a distance, you were in awe of its beauty. You were in awe of its massiveness. You were in awe of its holiness that it signified. You were in awe of the justice that it signified there, because the sacrifices happened there to make us right with God. And so this place screamed all that Jerusalem is supposed to be. But when Jesus walks through those gates, the outward appearance is beautiful, but what does he find when he gets in there? There's no fruit. So what was the point with the fig tree? Was it Jesus being hangry? It's an acted parable. The fig tree is all it is an acted parable of what's going to happen to Jerusalem and the temple. It's going to be judged and raised because it's not the real deal. It shouts to the world, holiness, beauty, justice, but inside it has none of that fruit. And it will be judged. Let's look at how Jesus carries it out. Verse 15, on reaching Jerusalem, he entered the temple courts, and then he just began driving out. John tells us he had a whip made of several cords. Just try to picture that. He drives people out who are buying and selling there, and he overturns the tables and the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. And he wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. So just picture Jesus almost out of control, so out of character, right? That people have been following him. It's like, who is this guy? He hasn't done anything like this. But it's holy indignation. Now, you got to understand something. Buying and selling was not bad. Matter of fact, it served the worshipers. Because if you were coming from far away and you had to bring a spotless lamb or a dove of some kind, you had to bring some animal, and you were going a long way through all sorts of difficult passages on foot, the odds of getting there with that thing still spotless and ready was very slim. So it served the worshipers to have a marketplace where you could go and say, okay, now that I'm in Jerusalem, let me get my animal now, and I can make sure it gets delivered correctly. But here's the problem. There already were 4 markets on the Mount of Olives. There were 4 markets on the Mount of Olives. It was already provided for. But what we know from history is sometime right before the days of Jesus, right before his days, the chief priests of Jerusalem decided, you know what? The heck with the Gentiles. Let's use the court of the Gentile. That's a lot of space. That's prime real estate. All that really matters is the temple. So let's set up and do a market there. And it was a competing rival market. It's like when Big Y moves in and they go in across the street from Stop and Shop. Or Lowe's comes in and they go across the street from Home Depot. All of a sudden there's rival markets. And one of them has prime real estate. Right there. I mean, why buy on the Mount of Olives? You got to go down the Kidron Valley 2 miles. Just buy it right there. Talk about convenience. And when there's rival competition, what happens to prices? And now they're competing against each other. And they're, well, you got the convenience of doing it here, so we can charge you a little more. And we know that they did. And they would often say things like, if someone did show up, well, you know, with an offering, well, actually, you know, that offering, it got spotted. No, it didn't. Yeah, it did. Yeah, we've got one you can buy over here. And that was happening rampantly. They had all sorts of stalls for salt and doves for the poor and all sorts of different things set up, animals of all kinds. It was just a biggie in there. Jesus is walking in. It's supposed to be a place where the Gentiles, he should have walked in and saw people praying to Almighty God. Instead, he sees people profiting in the holy precinct. And then it says he wouldn't let, verse 16, he wouldn't let anyone carry merchandise through the temple courts. What's that all about? Let me take you back to the picture again of the temple and Jerusalem, if we could. Because what happens is this gate right here. Remember I told you that when you're coming up the Kidron Valley, you go in this gate and go straight in the temple. Now, can we go back to the one of all of Jerusalem?